and Kaz. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panel, is perhaps the wrong word. We have the one of the co-authors of the book, Professor Henry Gao. He's a professor of law at the Singapore Management University, and I think undisputedly one of the preeminent scholars on WTO trade law in the world, and specifically on its intersection with the Chinese system and the Chinese approach to trade policy. And to torture him a little bit after he makes his remarks, we have with us Stuart Harbinson. Stuart needs no introduction from any of us in Geneva, and I won't rattle through his entire CV because we only have 90 minutes. But I think most relevantly to posing some questions and some reflections on Henry's work. He is a former chairman of the DSB, I believe, in a past life, an advisor and a chief of staff to two directors general of the WTO, and he served on a number of WTO panels. So he brings a phenomenal combination of legal expertise in this subject matter, but also I think the political news one gets inside a Director General's office. And I think it is impossible to look at any of these issues these days through a purely legal lens. So I'm very grateful that Stuart's able to join us. As a final point of housekeeping, the way we hope this session will work is that I will hand over to Professor Gao to make some introductory remarks, introduce the book, the core premise of his argument, and share some thoughts. Then we'll pass it over to Stuart for his initial round of reflections and see where that takes us before opening the floor to those of you here in the room and those of you online. For those of you joining us virtually, you can pose your questions at any time by opening up the Q&A box. That is the box that is at the bottom of your screen. If you mouse over it, that says Q&A, and typing your questions in there. I will then select a few to pose to Henry and Stuart for their thoughts and reflections. And with no further ado than that, allow me to hand you the floor, Henry, to tell us what this book is all about.
Thank you. Thank you, Dimitri, for that very kind introduction and also the kind invitation, and thanks in particular to the Conrad Adenauer Foundation for kindly hosting this and providing the space today. So it's a great honor and privilege to speak at this event, co-organized by the KAS, the CTEI, the Geneva Trade Platform, and also the HEI. So it's also a privilege today to have as the discussant Stuart Harbinson, old friend and longtime friend, who actually has another title that Dimitri didn't mention earlier. He is also the former permanent representative of Hong Kong to the GATT and the WTO, right? So in that capacity, he personally, I should mention, ushered China's transition towards market economy, which is the topic that I'm going to address today. So my new book is called Between Market Economy and State Capitalism, China's State-Owned Enterprises and the World Trading System, which I wrote with my wonderful co-author, Professor Zhou Wei-Huan from University of New South Wales, from Australia, who unfortunately could not join us today because of the time difference, but I'm sure that he would be interested in many of the discussions we will have later today. Our book addresses one of the most fundamental challenges to the multilateral trading system, the challenge of China's state capitalism. It was just published by Cambridge University Press 6 months ago. And actually, because of that, Cambridge is now running a promotion with a 20% discount. You all should have a flyer on your seat. So please feel free to peruse that if you wish. Now, even though the book is brand new, but as anyone who has written academic papers know, the process of planning the book takes much longer and started much earlier. And actually, the origin for the book project can be traced back to about 7 years ago, 2016, when actually the appellate body of the WTO hosted a series of conferences around the world from 2015 to 2016 in celebration of the 20th anniversary of the WTO appellate body. So it was hosted basically at the home institutions of the appellate body members, including some in Asia, like in Beijing, in Seoul, in Delhi, and also in the United States. It was hosted at Harvard University by Professor Mark Wu. And Professor Wu actually chose as the title for the conference, Old Rules, New Problems. So that was, I guess, a kind of a hint to his forthcoming influential paper, China Inc., which basically argued that the existing WTO rules are insufficient in dealing with China's state capitalism, and therefore we would need new rules. And actually, last month, I was at Harvard speaking about the book, again, at the invitation of Mark. And so I've been telling Mark that we've been continuing this debate for quite a while. And what we agree are the diagnoses. We both agree that China is a unique economic system, is a challenge to the world trading system. But what we disagree is in the prescription. He thinks that the patient cannot recover on his own, and I think that maybe there's a way to make it work. So we are continuing this debate. So when we started the book project back in 2016, the world was a very different place. There was no trade war. There was no real war between Russia and Ukraine, the motherland of Dmitry. And the US was still actively engaged in both the WTO and also in the free trade agreements, including in my region, the TPP. And the WTO appellate body was still functioning. Actually, I started my professional career as an intern in the appellate body secretariat. And when I worked as an intern 20 years ago, I remember that I had to work very hard. And in 2016, when I was talking to my former colleagues in the appellate body secretariat, the only complaint I received from them was that they had too much work to do, a complaint which you do not hear anymore. And we all know why. So fast forward 7 years to today, the world we are facing is very different. Many of these new developments have actually confirmed the concerns that we raise in the book, which I would summarize as two problems and one promise. The first problem is that China has turned further towards state capitalism and moved further away from the market economy. Of course, China itself would never openly admit that it practices state capitalism. Instead, according to the very first sentence of the very first article of the Constitution of the People's Republic China, the People's Republic China is a socialist state governed by a people's democratic dictatorship that is led by the working class and based on an alliance of workers and peasants. So in other words, China is officially a socialist or communist country, which by definition would practice a planned economy. So where did the market economy part come from? Well, I guess here we would need to take a walk down memory lane. When the PRC was established in 1949, the Chinese economic system indeed started out as the classic communist-style planned economy, where the production and sale of everything was subject to meticulous planning by the state. However, the communist experiment did not work very well, and China was at the brink of bankruptcy when Deng Xiaoping came into power 30 years later. Trying to save the Chinese economy, Deng invented the slogan, socialism with Chinese characteristics, and used that as a convenient label to sneak in capitalism and capitalists literally, actually, back then, many capitalists were literally sneaking from Hong Kong, into Shenzhen to help China to develop its capitalism. But due to the ideological oppositions within the party, Deng initially could not openly admit that he was introducing market economy. Instead, all he could say at the beginning was that we were doing so-called socialist commodity economy. That is allowing people to claim ownership of products so as to turn them into commodities that can be sold in the market rather than just products which would be subject to state planning. In 1992, echoing Deng's call to deepen the reform in his Southern Tour speeches, General Secretary Jiang Zemin further clarified in his political report to the 14th Congress of the China Communist Party that the objective of the reform was to establish a socialist market economy. But as communism is inherently incompatible with the market economy, the phrase was regarded as an oxymoron. So when the Chinese delegation rushed into the GATT conference room, waving copies of the Party Congress report announcing China's turn to a socialist market economy, former Assistant USTR Douglas Newkirk famously stated, "I know what is socialism, I know what is market economy, but I don't know what is socialist market economy." Well, it turned out that Newkirk was not alone. Even today, nobody, not even the top Chinese officials, can explain clearly what socialist market economy is. But people genuinely understood that to mean more market, less planning, more private firms, less state-owned enterprises or SOEs. So it is fair to say, as we have documented in the book and analyzed, that was basically the trajectory China was on when it joined the WTO in 2001. But when President Xi Jinping came in power 12 years later, he changed this slogan further to Xi Jinping's thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics. That is a mouthful. I always need to take a breath when I say that. So what's the difference with the original formulation by Deng, socialism with Chinese characteristics? I would say that the key difference is that the reform has backtracked. Thus, we see less emphasis on relying on the invisible hand of the market and more emphasis on the role of the state's visible hand through macro control. An euphemism for macro planning, or even worse, more on the role of the party, as seen through the new initiative to build party cells in all enterprises. And here we are not just talking about SOEs, but also private firms and even foreign invested firms, as we discussed and analyzed extensively in the book. So I would say that under Xi, China has turned from market to Mao and from capitalism to communism. So that is the first problem, the turn towards state capitalism. The second problem is that the negative implications of China's turn towards state capitalism will not be confined to just within its borders, but will be felt beyond its shores. This will come in three ways. First, as I argued in an op-ed which I wrote for the National Foundation for American Policy a year ago, the regulatory crackdown affects not just Chinese firms, but also foreign firms too. A good example is the recent fine on US accounting firm Deloitte, which was fined $30.8 million for allegedly failing to perform its duty in assessing the asset quality of China Huarong Asset Management Company, which is one of the largest asset management companies in China. But the irony is that Huarong itself was only fined about $100,000 in the very same case. So you have the main perpetrator only fined $100,000, and then you have the auditor who actually didn't commit any of these wrongdoings just because, they were, I guess, trusting their clients too much, they were fined $30.8 million US dollars, or, thousands of times the fine of the client. So what's the difference here? Well, the difference is that Huarong is a Chinese firm, but Deloitte is an American firm. So I guess this is a wake-up call for all foreign firms operating in China. Second, China's apparent success makes it harder for developed countries around the world to resist the soaring call of adopting the Chinese model, which Greg Schiffer and I calls the Beijing model or the Beijing consensus in our joint article, A New Chinese Economic Order, which was published in the Journal of International Economic Law 3 years ago. Moreover, with its growing economic clout, China can help propping up dictators around the world, just like what China has been doing with Russia. Third, the most worrying trend is the negative implications on the countries in the West, which unfortunately have now tried to copy China's model of promoting economic development with heavy reliance on subsidies and industrial policy, or to put it more colloquially, trying to out-China China by becoming more like China, as I mentioned in the recent Money Talks podcast hosted by The Economist. The good news, however, is that despite these two very serious problems, we also have a promise. And this is what we call in the title of the concluding chapter of our book, The Potential of Multilateralism. These include two aspects. The first is the potential of existing WTO rules to tackle China's state capitalism, especially those on subsidies and the China-specific provisions in China's accession package. Because I understand not everyone in the room is a trade remedies lawyer, so I do not want to bore you with the tricky, highly technical details on trade remedies. And also, I don't want to spoil you the fun of finding out the answers from the book. So I will not say more on this very technical subject. But suffice to say, as we outlined in the book, actually, if you look at these existing WTO rules, especially the ones in the subsidies and countervailing measures agreement, and also the China-specific rules in China's accession package, especially on subsidies, we think that it does provide a way to deal with many of the challenges presented by China's state capitalism. The second aspect is the potential of the WTO to make new rules to deal with the China challenge. Since the collapse of the Doha round at the fateful July meeting in 2008, many people have become skeptical of the ability of the WTO to come up with meaningful new rules. But I hope I can restore your confidence with some recent good news. And I guess you folks here in Geneva probably know more than me on this, so I will welcome any contributions. I mean, first, this is the conclusion in December 2021 of the Joint Statement Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation, an issue that has plagued my former colleagues at the WTO's Trading and Service Division for the past 20 years. And I should mention that the signatories to the deal include both the US and China. So that is really promising and encouraging. And the second is, hopefully, the upcoming conclusion of the Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce, which I understand is in the final stretch of work for a potential deal by the time of MC13, which will be held less than a year from today. So I would say that many of these proletariats actually do offer hope for a deal on many of the issues between China and other members. And here I want to give a plug to my friend Dimitri for his wonderful website, on the GSIs, which I understand is supported by the KAS. So please check it out when you have a minute. In addition to the highly technical, or as some would say, highly boring discussion of China's state capitalism in the world trading system, we also hope that our book can offer some guide on what needs to be done going forward. First, our book has shown that the world will need to understand China better. In chapter 2 of our book, we painstakingly documented and analyzed the contours of China's SOE reform in the past 4 decades. If you look at China's reform, if you use 1978 as a starting point, basically now it has come 45 years. And we actually argued, at least with regard to SOE reform, that the first 25 years, what you see is a shift towards market economy. I think there was a genuine effort to try to move towards market economy, to reform the SOEs, make them more playing by the rules of the market, and also to reduce the influence by the government and the party, to separate the enterprise from the government, and so on and so forth. But then in the last 20 years, what you see is a move towards state capitalism. So this basically started actually before President Xi came into office. You can see signs for this shift basically since 2013, since 2003. Under the administration of President Hu Jintao and Premier Wen Jiabao. And this actually further accelerated after 2008, after the global financial crisis, because in 2008, basically 2 things happened. First, in the West, you had the global financial crisis, which resulted in the relative decline of the US and the rest in the West. And second, you had the Olympic Games, which was held in China. And that was, regarded in China as a sign of China's, what they would call great rejuvenation of the Chinese state. And China's confidence was actually boosted. And actually, there was a very interesting anecdote that the former vice president of China, Wang Qishan, was receiving some American visitors, really high-level American visitors, I think, including the Secretary of the Secretary of Treasury, if I understand correctly, and he was telling the U.S. guests, "Look, we look at you, as teachers. Up to now, we wanted to copy everything from the U.S. Your economic system, your financial system, your security system, your corporate governance system, and so on. But now you are no longer our teacher because the teachers themselves have now fallen, from the podium." So these bolstered their confidence in their own system, and these further accelerated the shift towards state capitalism. But when President Xi came into office, you have more uncertainties. Just look at, what has been happening in China over the past 10 years, especially the most recent 5 years. It has been one surprise after another, the regulatory crackdowns affecting all these sectors, and also the lockdowns during the COVID, and so on. So going forward, we really need more analysis on the future direction of China's policy moves. And actually, I've been trying to do some of that. For example, I just had a new essay coming out with the Center for International Governance and Innovation in Canada, where I discuss whether China's regulatory crackdown would continue in the new year, and also more broadly, what kind of economic system President Xi would want to build in China. Second, there need to be a more aggressive enforcement of existing WTO rules to hold China accountable to what they have agreed to. Now, this could include bringing countervailing duty measures domestically against Chinese subsidies, or bring a so-called big, bold WTO case against China, as a former appellate body member, Professor Jennifer Hillman, proposed in her testimony at the US Congress 5 years ago. Actually, I was in DC last month speaking at the invitation of Professor Hillman. And when I mentioned this point, and she followed by saying that 5 years ago, when she raised this point before the Congress, many people in the Congress just brushed it off. But look, 5 years have passed. Had they followed her advice back then, at least 1,000 cases could have been brought against China and try to steer China, back towards market economy. So we really need to start acting. So what do we need to do to fully achieve the potential of multilateralism? In particular, I will focus on what the most powerful member, the United States, needs to do. First, the US would need to shoulder rather than shirk its leadership responsibilities at the international level by participating more actively in various WTO initiatives. As I suggested in my interview with the recent New York Times editorial, who benefits from confrontation with China. Without the leadership of the US, we cannot win this fateful battle between the market economy and the state capitalism. Second, the US will need to bring back the appellate body and help restore a functioning WTO dispute settlement system. I understand the US has recently announced that the US goal is to have a fully functioning dispute settlement system by 2024, but the US didn't really make clear whether this would include the appellate body. But without the appellate body, the new or existing rules of the WTO would be pretty useless because China, if got sued and lost, can always render the decision useless by so-called, as Professor used Pauline from the CTEI mentioned in his influential article, appealing into the void. So in order to fill the void, we need to act together. I will conclude my remarks here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Gauss. A lot to process there. It's interesting to contrast your, I suppose, your pessimism about the direction of China, at least from a traditional economic standpoint, and the direction of travel with something that I think is slightly unusual in Geneva, which is a real optimism about the potential of multilateralism to make concrete gains, whether it's through plurilaterals or a restoration of the dispute settlement system, more robust dispute settlement system. Thank you for the questions that have started to come in online. Before we turn to those, I might hand it over to Stuart. There's a lot there to have reflections on, and we would very much welcome them.
Thanks very much, Dimitri, and you're absolutely right. There's a huge amount there. I don't think I can cover everything, so I'll have to be a bit selective. But first of all, thanks to the Geneva Trade Platform for inviting me, and Olaf, to you and Cass for hosting this important event and giving me the opportunity to reconnect with a very old and dear friend, Henry. Henry actually is also an alumnus of Hong Kong, but he defected to Singapore at some point in time, which I don't blame him for, I must say. And of course, also he has WTO experience as well, so in the Secretariat. So it's great to see you again, Henry, and congratulations on the book, both to you and to Wei Huang-Zhou for tremendous effort. The conventional wisdom, of course, is that China has grown to its present economic state of development by gaming WTO rules. Rules which, according to this theory, were not in any case designed or able to cope with China's particular brand of state capitalism. And according to this theory, which we repeated quite often, China's accession to the WTO was more or less waved through by hopelessly gullible trade negotiators who foolishly thought that China was on a one-way ticket to a liberal market economy. So I think this very, very welcome book by Henry and Wei Huang-Zhou challenges that conventional wisdom, which many now take as read, and convincingly shows, in my view, that the accession process and package is and has been very undervalued. And I'll come back to that in subsequent remarks. I'd also just like to read out a quote from Gregory Schaffer in his foreword to the book, which I thought was very pertinent, where he says, "This book is sorely needed. A single vision regarding China and the trading system has become the norm in Washington, in which the US-China trade relationship is viewed in zero-sum terms. This is dangerous." So says Gregory Schaffer, and I think that's a very good point. Indeed, it's almost impossible these days to keep track of the blizzard of resolutions and bills, committees and initiatives emanating from Washington on an almost daily basis. I think I noticed one congressman recently talking, in fact, about the need for economic patriotism in the US. Two senators just yesterday or the day before introduced another resolution challenging China's ability to declare itself as a developing country. So this is a drumbeat which is becoming faster and faster. So much so that actually, I mean, I don't know if you know the former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating. I mean, he's not somebody I would agree with on every count, but he said in an interview quite recently that you do get the impression, listening to people in Washington, that there are some who would prefer that 20% of the world's population had remained in poverty. And I think that's a fair remark by Paul Keating. The book, coming back to the book, its cooler and more detailed analysis is very welcome and possibly overdue. I think, Henry, you said that actually you'd started this project 6 or 7 years ago. COVID, of course, was a problem, and I guess it's a shame in a way that we didn't get this earlier, in my view, and we would have done had it not been for the pandemic, I'm sure. But you have been giving us a regular output of articles and speeches and interviews along these lines. I think anyway, certainly the authors should be warmly congratulated for sticking to the task and now producing the book, which I think has been well worth the effort. One of the interesting parts of the book, I felt, was it traces the contours of China's SOE reforms and developments since 1978, when Deng Xiaoping started the reform and opening up process, and the conceptualization in the paper of 5 phases in this process. It's, I think, very useful to the outsider, because if we're not close to China, it's rather difficult to make sense of the SOE scene. And I thought the classification that you put in the book is very useful as a tool. And also in the process, I think, Henry, you pointed out, and I think you mentioned in your remarks also, the enhanced party control now in the current phase of SOE reform, which you actually link to the increased possibility of being able to show that SOEs are public bodies for the purposes of the ASCM. Then in the subsequent chapter, having talked about SOEs, you go on to look at how China's state capitalism was addressed in the accession negotiations. And this particularly struck a chord with me because I was in the room a lot during those negotiations and followed them very, very closely. As I think people here would know, far from China being waved through as a member, the accession negotiation took 15 years. And at various points, the negotiations were stalemated and nothing happened for several months. And there were really serious doubts as to whether they would ever be concluded. From time to time, as I recall from personal experience, there were quite explosive sessions in the conference rooms at the Centre William Rapard, with arguments breaking out between the chairman and the leader of China's delegation and the leader of the US delegation in particular. Insults were traded sometimes, and on a couple of occasions, I remember clearly the Chinese delegation walking out. So, they did come back later. They were persuaded to come back later, obviously. But I just want to mention this to make the point that this was not an easy negotiation. There was a lot of metaphorical blood on the floor in these negotiations. The book doesn't cover, because it's not really in the scope of the book, for example, Premier Zhurongji's trip to Washington in April 1999, which was, supposed to set the seal on the bilateral deal with the US. But President Clinton backed away at the last minute, leaving Premier Zhu high and dry. So, I just mentioned this to make the point that this was a knife edge negotiation all the way through, and it could have gone either way. I think the book captures very well, Henry, if I may say so, the kind of methodology and the mood that was adopted in the Working Party and the accession negotiations. It's absolutely correct that members did not spend time debating ideological issues such as how to make China accept the abstract concept of the market economy. That was not the way to go, and it would have been a useless and fruitless pursuit in any case, bearing in mind that the WTO has to accommodate all sorts of different economic systems. So, I think a lot of members would have found it very difficult to accept the idea that everyone had to be shoehorned into the same category. And in any case, it was never going to be the case that China would agree to change its entire economic system. So instead, the focus in the Working Party, as the book recounts accurately, was on the more pragmatic and mercantilist question of making sure that SOEs wouldn't frustrate China's fulfillment of its accession obligations. And in that respect, of course, there were several very specific China provisions which were regarded after the accession as WTO plus and discriminatory, particularly the safeguard provisions and the non-market economy provisions as well. So, although my clear recollection is that the government in Beijing made a strenuous effort to portray the accession as a really important moment for the country, there were a lot of people who felt that, it was a bad deal. I can remember actually visiting Beijing with Dr. Superchai, who was then the Director General, and this was after China had acceded to the WTO, and there had been a national push to explain the WTO to people. Even taxi drivers understood WTO. If you said WTO, the taxi driver would understand. And Dr. Superchai's task was to make the winning draw in a competition which had attracted millions of people. I think the prize was a trip to Geneva, actually.
Yes.
The second prize was 2 trips to Geneva, actually. But it was really interesting. Millions of people tuned in and watched it. The questions were quite hard, actually. The questions were about the WTO and WTO rules. So there was a huge push to explain this to the Chinese people, but still there was this feeling that the package was discriminatory. So I would say that I would agree with the authors of the book that any frustration felt over the trajectory of economic reform in recent years doesn't really justify a revisionist history of the accession negotiations. Then the book goes on, Henry, to, as you mentioned, to discuss the limitations of general WTO rules. And I think I would agree with you on that. You know, the rules on STEs, for example, are extremely weak. I thought, if I may say, that I thought you might have undervalued the importance of anti-dumping in current WTO rules. I may have misunderstood on that point. But I looked at the WTO's trade remedy database the other day, and it shows, in terms of anti-dumping investigations, about 3,100 procedures which led to the application of measures in force on or after the 1st of January 2020. That's counting investigations as individual to each country. So if you have an investigation which covers 5 countries, then in the WTO counting, as I understand it, that's 5 investigations. And of those 3,100, China featured in over 1,000. So that's a lot. And as we know, you just have to announce an investigation and the trade is chilled. So, we shouldn't underplay this. Then the more specific section in chapter 5 of the book, I think, Henry, challenges the mainstream view that existing WTO rules are inadequate to deal with Chinese SOEs and industrial subsidies. And that is in relation to China-specific rules, taking into account the specific commitments in the protocol of accession in particular. And so you're saying that the real problem is not the lack of rules, but the underuse of invoking those rules, which you mentioned in your talk. Then we go to, I thought the really interesting part of the book, but it's all interesting, and I laid stress in particular on the account of the accession negotiations. But the potential for multilateralism is a very interesting area, and you focus there on litigation and negotiation. There are people who, of course, say that litigation these days is futile. The rules don't cover China's practices, but Henry says that they do, and I think he's got a good point there. But then even if they do, the appellate body has kind of toned down how they might apply to China. But I think there's evidence in the book that some of the more recent jurisprudence might disprove that. And in any case, you have new elements of evidence coming in, such as increased party control of SOEs. And then thirdly, there's the assertion that even if the complainant wins, China might comply on paper, but in practice, it won't on the substance. But I'm not sure that the track record bears that out. So Henry mentioned the idea of a broad-based collective case on China, which was Jennifer Hillman's idea a few years ago. how would that get on now is an interesting question. Of course, the US is not party to the MPIA, but the EU and Japan now are parties to the MPIA. So if a case were taken, the results, the process might go in different directions depending on who the complainants were. And it's an interesting area to speculate about. What would be China's response is a good question that maybe it would be interesting to hear more from Henry about. If China were to lose a case like this, I think you cite in the book that in one of the anti-dumping cases in the last couple of years, China has appealed into the void. Mm-hmm. I think it's photovoltaic elements and things like that. But on the other hand, as you also say, that China wants to be a good citizen, wants to support multilateralism. So I imagine there would be some tension there in China's thinking between wanting to protect themselves and the ability to appeal into the void on the one hand, and the ability and also the desire to show oneself to be a good citizen on the other. So that's an interesting area that I don't know if Henry can make a further comment about. And then there's also the interesting question of whether China would take a leaf out of the US book and plead a defense of national security. Well, I'm doing all of this on national security grounds. And as we know, the US feels that this is entirely self-judging. Shouldn't be. I would assume that the US would not challenge such a defense. But that's if you've got any further comments on that, Henry, I think it would be very, very useful. In terms of negotiations, finally, I must wrap up because I think I've been going on a little bit too long. Quite interesting to hear your reflections on the JSIs, particularly on domestic regulation and on e-commerce. I mean, on domestic regulation, the US only came on board at the very last minute, whereas China was on board for quite a long time. E-commerce, it's always been thought that there are some subjects in the e-commerce JSI which would create difficulties to get a landing zone, but they do look as if they're determined to find a way through it. We'll have to wait and see on that. I think I'll stop there, Dimitri. Yeah.
Thank you. That was tremendously comprehensive and a good walkthrough, I think, of many of the strengths of the book. We'll turn to questions in just a moment, but I think, Stuart, you raised a couple of really interesting questions for Henry, and I might just put one of them to you in two parts, maybe adding a little bit of my side as well to abuse the chair's prerogative since yours couldn't make it. I think one of Stuart's questions was, if there was a concentrated legal effort to contain the excesses of Chinese state capitalism through the WTO, and China were to lose those disputes, how do you anticipate a Chinese response? But I also wanted to come back to something you were saying when you were describing the accession. And you said, even at the time when they were joining, when China was, I think, in a much weaker position than it is today, much less assertive position than it is today, WTO accession was never about fundamentally changing the Chinese system. And I think if we accept the premise of your book, that WTO rules are sufficient du jour to challenge some of China's enterprises, I guess I'd be interested to also hear, what is the goal of a legal strategy then? If you cannot fundamentally change their system through a series of disputes, what would you say in your recommendations to the US and others would be the purpose?
Okay. Thank you, Stuart and Dimitri, for those really thought-provoking questions. These are difficult questions, and I will try to answer as much as I can. First, regarding Stuart's point on the importance of the anti-dumping measures, I agree fully with you that anti-dumping, has been used extensively against Chinese firms. But the point that I was trying to make in the book is that anti-dumping and subsidy countervailing actions actually they affect different types of enterprises. So if you look at most of the firms which are affected by anti-dumping, they tend to be private firms in China, while subsidies by definition would target more state-owned firms, SOEs. So if the US and other members are really interested in, fighting state capitalism and promoting market economy in China, what they should do is stop doing anti-dumping cases or do less anti-dumping cases and focus more on the subsidies countervailing cases, because this would hurt mainly the SOEs, and actually this would be welcomed by the private firms in China, because this would create a more bracing space for him by removing the harmful subsidies, which not only harm the international competitors, but also the competitors in the domestic Chinese market, most of which are private firms. Now, the big question, raised by both you, Stuart, and you, Dimitri, what if China lose, and also what is the goal of the legal strategy? Well, I will address the issue of legal strategy first. This is an issue that actually we discuss a bit in the book. I guess, Dimitri, you probably haven't had time to peruse that part because it's towards the later chapters where we outline the litigation strategy. But not to spoil the fun, I would just say that what we are seeing is that we are suggesting that you should select strategic sectors. For people who are familiar with the civil rights litigation in the U.S. Would know that, in the U.S. There's this history of people selecting, what they would call the model cases, right? Basically these are representative cases which are carefully selected by the civil rights lawyers, so that they can challenge it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and this would affirm, certain principles. And we would basically suggest the same way in the WTO. So select a few high-profile cases in strategic sectors, with representative types of subsidies, industrial policy. And even though in the WTO, strictly speaking, there's no, legal rule of stare decisis or precedence, but in practice, we all know that, there's a kind of a de facto presidential system. So once you basically challenge China in these sectors, in these cases, hopefully this would establish a kind of a rule down the road, and then you could use this, either to tell China, look, you cannot do this in the future, or this would make it easier for other members to challenge the similar type of actions. So that is basically the legal strategy. But what if China loses? Well, I guess history here can offer us some answer. If you look at China's compliance record with adverse decisions in the WTO, I would say that China actually is not a particularly bad WTO member. Actually, even compared to the US, China actually has a compliant record that is not, as bad as the US. Actually, the US has been, behaving quite, naughty recently. And if you look at China's compliance record, it has complied with most of the cases. But where, Stuart mentioned this case where China appealed into the void. So if you look at the case, who's the other party? The US. Right, that is apparently, a tit for tat with the U.S. because the U.S. destroyed their appellate body and is not a member of the NPRA. So what do you expect China to do, right? Of course, they would exercise their right. So the solution to that as we mentioned in the book, is to bring back the appellate body. If you bring back the appellate body, that is the binding dispute settlement system. There's no reason China or any other WTO member could appeal into the void. So the U.S. actually is undermining itself, is basically to borrow a saying that the Chinese diplomats use very often these days, the U.S. is picking up the stone to drop on its own fate, right? So I don't really understand the U.S. strategy, because, if the U.S. really want to have, new banning rules against China, why not restore the appellate body? Because what are the use of rules when you cannot enforce them? Do you really expect that you can tell the Chinese, look, we have the new rules, you have to comply with the new rules? They are currently number 2. Maybe one day they will be on par with the US as the largest economy in the world. So when that happens, you can't really tell China, to do what you tell them to do. But what you should try to do is to make sure that China would do what the rules tell them to do. I think that is the best approach. Yeah.
Thank you, Henry. I might now turn it over to questions, maybe starting with if anyone's got a question in the room. Yes, sir.
Just a quick question. Why do you think that there hasn't been a case like this brought against China by the US in the past before the appellate body was discontinued?
Well, there are several reasons, but I think the biggest reason would be the political reason, because the US, at least certain elements in the US sees it to their advantage to have, China as the perceived enemy. They think that they can benefit from this confrontation with China. And also, I understand this is actually consistent policy across multiple U.S. administrations, because if you look at the sabotaging of the appellate body, actually it didn't start with the current administration. It started with the Obama administration, was carried over by the Trump administration and then the Biden administration. So when they are busy destroying the appellate body, of course, they would not want to bring all these cases, because they knew that if they bring new cases, China could just appeal into the void. So again, here I fail to understand the U.S. logic. Yeah, so unless they bring back the appellate body, bring such a case would be futile, because China can always appeal into the void.
Thank you. Did you have any reflections on that, Stuart? Or
not really. No, I think Henry answered that quite well. I would just say that why no big case so far? Because of this feeling that the rules are not strong enough to tackle China's policies, and the feeling until the appellate body was no longer functional anyway, up until that point, a feeling that the appellate body would somehow soften their judgment. This is, I guess, goes back to things like zeroing and that sort of thing. Judgments, not the appellate body does judgments, but findings that basically said that certain US practices, which they were using against China, were wrong and didn't comply with WTO rules. So I think for those reasons, probably that kind of put the brakes on a big case.
Yeah, actually, just to answer, Stuart's point that the perception that the existing rules are insufficient. We discussed this extensively in our book. And in addition to the discussion on the finer details of the jurisprudence, 2 points I think particularly worth mentioning here is that one, the appellate body actually has softened its approach. In one of the later cases, there was, of course, the famous US 80-70 case where the appellate body basically said for public body, you cannot just take ownership, you must be exercising some government function. But in a later case, also between the US and China, the appellate body has a softened approach by basically saying that, once you prove an SOE is a public body, you do not have to prove it in every transaction, so this holding, would apply for every future cases. So that is actually a big win for the US, and I don't understand why the US don't pick that up. And another point which we also emphasize in the book is the fact that, now with this new drive for so-called party building in all kinds of firms in China. So basically what you see is that the Communist Party has required all firms in China to start to build party cells. And you don't just do it, behind closed doors. Instead, you have to change the constitution, the articles of association of the company to spell out exactly, it's clearly in the constitution of every company to say that, first of all, we establish the party committee. And second, the party committee must be consulted on all major decisions affecting, the company, and they would have a veto power, in all these major decisions. So if you want a determination for public body, that is right there, President Xi has handed the answer to you in a plate, right? But instead of taking the plate, what the US has been doing is kicking away the plate and keep saying that the WTO is insufficient, right? But now, with all these party building initiatives, I could not understand, what more stronger evidence you would need, this is it. I mean, actually, the EU has been using this. The EU actually is smarter than the US in many ways, including this. So we cited this case in our book, which is a case concerning a firm from Xiamen, which is a city in China. And actually, this firm is not even SOE. It's not even a Chinese firm. It's technically a foreign investor firm, even though I think it's probably Chinese money that went for a swim in one of those Cayman Islands and then came back, as a foreign investor firm. And then the EU was doing this anti-dumping case, and they look at actually the website of the company where they have this, section on party building, where they said, okay, we have this wonderful party committee. They have been doing this, they have been doing that, they have been guiding us in all these decisions. And the EU used that, in the very case, to show that, it was actually controlled by the government. So, if the EU could use it, then the US could use it, and there's evidence right there. So it's only for you to pick it up. Yeah.
Can I pick up on something that you said sort of midway through that answer about party cells? Because it ties really well to a question from, I'm going to do my best with the name, Vandana Gyanchandani, who basically, and I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, Henry, but he basically said, look, if you look at a lot of what we've been discussing so far in the WTO accession rules, they were set up to prevent unfair competition. And these are the kind of things we've been talking about. But now we're looking at a situation specifically in the digital sector space, where for the first time you have Chinese companies that are looking to compete globally and offer digital services globally, and TikTok being the most visible example, but I don't think it'll be the last, and I don't even think it's unique. How, given that what you've just described, you've got a party cell structure, many of these businesses weren't necessarily national champions and aren't being unfairly subsidized, but at the same time, you have a situation where there is a party cell in the company and all major decisions have to be run past the party cell. How should governments be reacting to this? And is the WTO at all relevant to discussions around this, which aren't necessarily about unfair competition, but are obviously a really topical question about state capitalism?
That's a great question. Thank you, Dimitri. Now,
Vandana actually said.
Yeah. Thank you, Vandana. Now, you raise a very interesting point. I mean, you see all these digital giants, like TikTok, like Alibaba, and so on. I mean, they are private companies. Even until now, they are private companies. But what the Chinese government has been doing is this so-called mixed ownership reform, which again we discussed in the book. So what they are doing is that, for example, for SOEs, they would have a private equity coming in, to contribute to the SOEs. But on the other hand, for all these private firms, the government would also take, part of the equity of the company, maybe 1% of the company. The government would contribute the capital. But even though it's just 1%, this is a golden share, which means that the government would have control on key decisions. And that indirectly kind of turned them, into public body. And also there's another provision in the national security law of China, which basically says that, if the Chinese government so requests, then every Chinese citizen and firm would have the responsibility to assist the national security institutions in carrying out its tasks. So that is something that is worrisome, because firms like TikTok, like Huawei, even though they are technically private firms, they have this obligation to assist with the national security, institutions. And this is what really raised, the eye of many governments in the West and beyond. So, again, I don't understand the logic of these provisions. I understand the politics behind it, but it is basically shooting itself in the foot for Chinese firms. All these Chinese firms. I just came back actually from a trip to China last month, and I've been talking to some of them, including some of the biggest digital firms, and they've been telling me that we don't like this provision, but there's nothing we could do. So I guess in that sense, bringing well-coordinated WTO cases could also help them. And China is such a huge economy. If you think that you can force China to adopt the route of market economy, as Stuart has vividly, outlined in his remarks, during the accession negotiation, when China was much weaker, when China acceded to the WTO, China was only the sixth largest trader in the world. Now it is the biggest trader in the world. So back then you couldn't force China. Now, of course, you cannot force China. But where do you, get China to move towards market economy? You have to rely on all these private firms in China, right? You have to make it easier for them to compete against the SOEs, for them to get breathing space, so that they would help build out the market economy. Because all these firms, they want to operate in a market economy. They don't like all these, concessions given to SOEs, the unfair competitive terms they have to deal with. So I guess that is the hope. Yeah.
I wanted to turn to another question from online, which I think builds on a different part of your remarks. It's a question from Candace White, who mentions that you've spoken quite a bit about what the US role is in preserving kind of the continuity of market economies. What about the role of, and Candace asked specifically about G7 nations. I know you talked a little bit about the EU, but I think a really frequent question we hear from people in the audience and from delegates when we host events is something to the tune of, if I am a New Zealand, if I am an Australia, if I am a Costa Rica, and I see the value of the multilateral trading system, what is an argument? What can I do to make these larger players see the value of it and to preserve that system, which is more valuable to a middle player that can't simply rely on economic hard power to win the day?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm afraid I don't have a ready answer, because the thing is, if you look at all these big players, the US, especially to a lesser extent, the EU, Japan, Australia, and so on. Even though trade is global, politics is always local, at the end of the day, the politicians have to answer to, local political pressures. So I guess in theory, we are all, members of this church established by David Ricardo, who basically says, because of comparative advantage, therefore, free trade is, good for everyone. But when you are in an environment like this, the pandemic and then the trade war, there will be enormous political pressure. And it doesn't help that we also have this real war between Russia and Ukraine, because I actually have another new paper, coming out where I discuss the disruption of the Ukraine war to global supply chains and also China's role in the supply chain. And my argument is that when people are looking at Russia in the Ukraine war and taking all these sanctions against China, on the back of the mind, actually, they are thinking about China, right? Let's be frank. So they are thinking that what if there's a war, in Asia, then how could we sanction China? There are many things I don't understand, and I especially don't understand why China would support Russia, from the beginning of the war until now, because again, it is shooting itself in the foot. Even if China didn't help Russia, people would still be suspicious of China, right? Because they think that China is going to be the next Russia, because China's economy is like 10 times that of Russia, right? 10 times more powerful. So if it does something, then it's going to be more devastating than what Russia has been doing. But China, further this suspicion by, helping out Russia, which is not really to its benefit. I don't understand it, maybe because I'm a lawyer, not a politician. The politicians probably have good reasons, but here, I would say that, again, like other countries in China, politics is number one, and it is largely determined by internal politics. So unfortunately, I don't have a solution for this. I think this is beyond the scope of a WTO law.
Stuart, is it beyond this? Do you have any advice for our G7 brethren? And then we'll take one final question.
So, the question is, what can be done to make the large players more mindful of multilateralism? I guess that's the question. Well, I don't think everything is lost. I am a little bit cynical about processes like the G7 and the G20, because the G20 has been talking about WTO reform for a long, long time now and hasn't produced anything. But the fact is that if you look at individual players in the G20, there are a lot of countries, medium-sized countries perhaps, which are very strong supporters of the multilateral trading system and will continue to be so. The EU is one of the larger players and is certainly a strong supporter of the multilateral trading system. And you can make a decent case out, as Henry has, that China is also in many respects a very strong supporter of the multilateral trading system. So it's a question. I suppose the geopolitical stars may not be aligned right now, but I think there is an underlying certain amount of glue in the system that will come through, when the conditions are more favorable.
Glue the stars, if we're mixing
glue the stars, is what I
Olaf was pointing out questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Etienne Denami from the French Mission. Mr. Gill, you said that you were considering the EU smarter than the US on this issue. I have to say, you have more and more politicians in Europe, which would probably rather think with us. So that's the debate is also changing in the EU. My question relates to what you said about China's track record in terms of compliance with its WTO rules. You have obviously a more positive assessment than the USTR in its recent annual USTR report on Chinese compliance. And I would like to hear you on this, because that's also some questions we get.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Well, I understand that the USTR has been repeating this argument that China has not complied, and in academic circles, there's this theory that China's compliance is so-called paper compliance. But my response to that is that all WTO members does that. China is not alone, right? So if you look at many of the problems the U.S. Identified, for example, in the USTR report and so on, some of these problems actually go beyond the scope of a WTO law. And some of the other problems, to the extent that they are covered by WTO rules, you kind of wonder why the U.S. has been repeating, the same, accusation every year now for 22 years, after China's accession, without raising a case. If I were them, it would be much easier for me to bring a case, right, rather than recycle the same, accusations every year. But again, I understand there are political reasons behind this, so. I guess that is not a call probably made by the USTR. There are other reasons. Yeah.
Thank you. Did we have one last final quick question? No? We have a question. I had one job. One final question from Gandaga Patraj Raja. Okay, so this is kind of a broad WTO question. I think this will resonate with you, perhaps you, Stuart, even more than you, Henry. It's a very WTO question, which is given that it's kind of the seemingly global understanding that trade has a distributional benefits problem, and the need to address that. And given the asymmetries and gaps in existing agreements, especially the agreement on agriculture and around food subsidization and farm subsidies. Many, including India, have been asking for something to be done about that. Do you see any kind of prospect of a more even-handed solution on some of these long-standing bugbears that are sort of at the heart of criticisms around asymmetry and inequalities in the WTO?
Well, it's a very good question again, but a very complicated question. If you read Jake Sullivan's recent speech to the Brookings Institute, he constantly harps on this theme about the distributional inequalities that have resulted from trade. In many cases, this is a domestic issue. There's no doubt that it is an issue, but what can the WTO do to address that issue in the United States or India or anywhere else? There's a limit. The national governments have to take responsibility at a certain point in time. Of course, the trouble is it's very easy to pin the blame on a multilateral institution in Geneva for these undesirable distributional consequences. I think the responsibility lies largely with national governments, frankly. But I suspect that underlying that question are issues such as public stockholding and that sort of thing, and pleas from India for special safeguard mechanisms and all of that in agriculture. And of course, those can be negotiated in Geneva. It actually is related to China, because China is a member of the G33 in agriculture and wants special treatment. And it comes to this question of whether it's really a developing country or not. Do we treat China and India in the same way as we treat the Solomon Islands, which is also a member? And it's a very complicated issue. China is taking the view that, on a case-by-case basis, it may be able to be flexible, but you can't tell it that it's not a developing country.
I think a good place to tie all of this back together and back to the theme of Henry's books is that the only way you could ever conceive of addressing something like the imbalances in the Agreement on Agriculture around what's called AMS, so dedicated support for farming, would require the big players to be willing to sacrifice for the sake of the system, really. And a big part of the puzzle on getting them to that point is believing that the system can address the pressing problems that they see in the world. And I think Henry's book and Henry's argument today lays out a vision that the WTO rules as they're written and the WTO processes as there are ongoing could potentially be that road if members are willing to walk it. So to perhaps not to satisfy again the guy's question, but I think there is no way those massive imbalances will be addressed unless there is a resurgence of faith in the system. And I think Henry's text lays out a vision for one way that you could potentially try to restore that faith among the big players whose buy-in you'd need to do that. And I might leave it there. Let me thank you again, Professor Gao, Stuart, for joining us. Thank you for sharing this book, for your insights. It's been a fascinating conversation for me, and I hope for our audience. Let me once again thank Kaz for hosting us, to all of you for joining us, my amazing events team, who you can't see on camera, but are sitting behind about 15 screens, and it feels like every piece of equipment money can buy, trying to make this a smooth experience for you while I forget to check questions online, as was my sole function as moderator. Let me encourage you all very much to pick up a copy of Henry's book. Use that discount code that's on your seats or in the chat, and learn a lot more about the Chinese journey into the WTO and where we can go from here. So thank you again, Henry, Stuart, and everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Now we can answer the real question.
Yes.
Very good. What did you think of the last bit of Jake's speech?